Excellent. Okay, so I'm presenting on behalf of Mark and I today. Mark's traveling on business, but he may get the opportunity to jump in and hopefully hear the discussion, but it is being recorded. So our chapter is about the legal status of pathogens at the WHO. So we found that they're sort of stuck somewhere between common heritage resources and sovereign genetic resources. So I'll start with a bit of history and a tiny bit of virology. So viruses have been shared pretty informally between networks of WHO labs since the early 1950s, particularly influenza virus, which is the virus on the left there. And then I've got that next to the virus that everyone is about sick of now, MERS coronavirus, sorry, not MERS, SARS-CoV-2 virus related to MERS, which is the cause. So this one's the causative agent of COVID-19. And viruses are probably one of the last genetic resources that are still being transferred between countries and between researchers in a very informal way, apart from obviously import-export rules. So the reason I've got these pictures here is because I just wanted to say that SARS-CoV-2 virus has got that one nucleic acid in there. It's an RNA strand, and it accumulates mutations as it moves around and infects people. And so that's why it evolves to create new variants that will behave slightly differently to the variants before them. And so influenza virus does this too. It will accumulate mutations and it will have these slight changes, which leads to what influenza virologists talk about as genetic drift. But what's different with influenza virus and the reason why the WHO wants to keep a very close eye on this virus is because it's got a segmented genome. So instead of just the one RNA, it's got 8 RNAs. So if you get 2 of these viruses infecting one cell at any given time, it can chop and change, and you can have various segments from one virus get packaged up in the capsid of another virus, and essentially what's happening is it's creating an entirely new flu virus that our immune systems haven't seen, and this is called genetic shift. So we've got genetic drift, which is the small gradual changes which give us seasonal flu, and genetic shift, which gives us these new viruses that have pandemic potential. So this is why it's important for the WHO to constantly monitor what flu virus strains are doing in the environment from all different countries. They want to use this information to create seasonal vaccine strains and also to warn the world when we might have an entirely new influenza virus that's emerged. So this picture also hints at the fact that viruses are genetic resources in accordance with the CBD and Nagoya Protocol. So they're just a bunch of nucleic acids packaged up with protein, and they do fit within the definition within the CBD. And in 2007, Indonesia used this definition in the CBD to claim that they had sovereignty over their pandemic influenza viruses, and they withheld their H5N1 virus samples from the WHO, despite there being this decades-long history of sharing very informally. And this was a big deal because at the time, influenza virus was causing about an 80% case fatality rate in Indonesia. And also they were starting to get human-to-human transmission of a virus that had previously been transmitted mostly from birds to humans. So these virus samples were really very valuable to the WHO as part of their global influenza surveillance activities. So Indonesia claims sovereignty over their viruses. The global south largely backs them up, and the global north doesn't. They are horrified and say things like, you can't own a virus, and viruses aren't the type of genetic resources that the CBD sought to protect. But in 2011, after years of talks, the World Health Assembly adopts the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. And this is essentially an access and benefit sharing framework that's sort of retrofitted to that existing network of WHO labs that I was talking about before. So this is important for our purposes, is that they've sort of taken on Indonesia's argument and accepted it, and then put it in the PIP framework as well, and say that they recognize the sovereignty of states over their biological resources. So they recognize it, but then they only apply this framework and the access and benefit sharing rules within it to the very tiny subset of influenza viruses that have the potential to cause a pandemic. So they haven't even included the seasonal influenza viruses that I was talking about before. And this means they've recognized sovereign rights, they've only applied them to a certain subset of viruses, and then by default, the rest of human pathogens will be existing in that CBD space and the Nagoya Protocol. And the WHO does absolutely nothing to sort of follow up on this. And it really doesn't take long before this becomes a problem for them. So this was 2011. And in 2012, we get MERS coronavirus, or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. This is a long, great story, which I won't go into in too much detail, but essentially, a physician in Saudi Arabia sends a sample from one of his patients to a lab in the Netherlands. They test it, they figure out that it's a novel coronavirus. They immediately put in a patent application for it and a whole bunch of things that they can do with it. And then they start sharing this virus with a whole bunch of other laboratories around the world, under the terms of their own material transfer agreement. So this institute in the Netherlands. And the Saudi government was pretty annoyed by this, particularly given the rhetoric by the WHO in the year prior, recognizing their sovereign rights. And so they were saying that this was infringing on it. And the Director General of the WHO sort of jumped into this argument and said that countries shouldn't be sharing coronavirus samples in a bilateral manner. And of course, it's their right to do that under the CBD. But she said, no, we're not doing that. You should share in a multilateral manner through the WHO. And yeah, so the point of our paper is that this has happened multiple times after the MERS incident, so I won't go into any more, but the paper details a few more examples of where the WHO has sort of wanted its cake and eat it too, where they want to say you have to share openly, and yeah, we recognize sovereignty, but you're not allowed to exercise your sovereignty in the way that the CBD and Nagoya Protocol would allow you to do. So it wasn't until 2019 that the WHO started getting serious about working out what its approach to pathogen sharing would be, and looking at the CBD and Nagoya Protocol and trying to figure out what special considerations should be taken into account, where it fits with the PIP framework. Is the PIP framework a specialized instrument under Article 4 of the Nagoya Protocol? No one knows. This COVID pandemic, for instance, has really highlighted how important it is to be sharing samples very quickly, and also the associated information. So they're having issues with the DSI debate as well at the WHO. They call it the genetic sequence data issue. And this has become a big body of work for the WHO. And I can't help but think that if they had tackled it a little bit earlier, in 2011, that they might be able to come up with a more consistent approach, particularly now because we've got all these calls for a pandemic treaty. We heard a little bit about this today with Sam's presentation this morning. And so before really figuring out what the rules are and what the incentives are for pathogen sample sharing, with the CBD and Nagoya Protocol and the PIP framework, we're talking about introducing yet another instrument that's going to cover a very small subset of viruses, those with pandemic potential, access and benefit sharing under the pandemic treaty. So there's a whole bunch of issues with the pandemic treaty, but that's probably a talk for another day. And thanks very much for listening. Happy to hear lots of ideas and comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. This is a huge area to look into, but again, it's so refreshing to see, going back again and looking at the first principles, common heritage or the common concern of humanity. I just wonder, is there any discussion in WHO circles, particularly given the rise of One Health, of a third option for something that might be less human-centric? So that, the common heritage of nature, for instance, does it have to be the dichotomy? It's either common heritage of humankind or common concern of humankind. Is there a third option being bandied about?
No, it's it's really myopic. So they're only ever talking about human pathogens, and there's never any talk with as far as I'm aware, with the FAO and the OIE about, particularly the OIE would be a big one, about any of the viruses that could jump species. And like even influenza virus, the OIE has their own, and the FAO have their own off-flu system, surveillance system that they use together. And that's separate to the PIP framework system, and the PIP framework doesn't apply to any of those samples. So yeah, no, that One Health is this huge, there's a lot, I was going to say rhetoric, it's not just rhetoric, this stuff there's substance behind it, but it hasn't, the ABS world at the WHO hasn't caught up, but they're so far behind on everything. It would take a genius like you, Fran, to bring it up to them. You should get in there.
Thanks, Michelle. So I can't see any other questions in chat, but we have Amber with her hand up.
So always got her hand up. Michelle, I always enjoy the way you presented it. I learned something new every time. But what I didn't quite understand, but maybe I blinked, what is the conclusion? I mean, are you going to wrap the chapter up? I mean, what is your opinion? You think there should be a pandemic treaty? I mean, do you think it should be more holistic, or do you think there's any hope of that? And in particular, in a very concrete sort of political timing wise, when will the WHO do these things? And are there any signs that the WHO will wait for COP15 and for the CBD to make a decision, particularly, of course, on DSI? I think it's so interesting that the international treaty, the plan space, literally that the governing body meets the next day after COP15 is supposed to end. So it's clear that they're waiting and going to meet almost directly on the heels, literally directly on the heels of the CBD decision. Are there any indications in the WHO calendar similarly, or what is your recommendation, and what is the timing that you can read between the lines from whatever's been released so far?
So I absolutely don't think that there should be a pandemic treaty at the moment, which would be a very unpopular thing to say in Europe, because they're really, really pushing ahead with this at the moment. They think there's momentum to do it now, but I really think that we haven't, like, we're still dealing with this pandemic. We haven't actually figured out what the lessons are. It'd be nice to do it in the wash up and figure out what really went wrong, what was most important, and then start to look for the different solutions that could be made in a pandemic treaty. Plus we've got the international health regulations, and there's a whole bunch of legal issues there. I definitely don't think they'll wait for the CBD on this. They're just pushing ahead anyway, despite the fact that they're probably not going to get a whole heap of signatories to this treaty either. So yeah, I'm always bewildered by the WHO. The biohub, for instance, Sam was talking about the biohub this morning, and that was announced in quite a unilateral way, without much regard to access and benefit sharing conversations that were going on. And it's nice to see that they've got some principles available online now. But yeah, same goes with we've spoken before about how there's existing infrastructure for sharing pathogen samples, and instead of using what's there, they want to create something new all the time. And yeah, it's staggering sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, there's the WHO reference laboratories, number one. Yeah. I mean, their own reference laboratories. I mean, second, then there's also distributed collections, some of which are reference laboratories that also do, large scale global distribution. That, yeah, and yeah. And although, as Rodrigo points out, I mean, the principles are sort of compatible with ABS, it's sort of silent on how it's going to handle ABS. I think I remember if you do a control F search through that biohub document, they basically say, oh, we punt on ABS. Like it's there, but it's kind of your problem. So something like that. There's a sentence in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks,
so,
Michelle.
Same strategy since 2011, consistent in their inconsistency.
Thanks, Amber. Charles.
Oh, Charles, you're on mute.
You're still on mute. Charles, can you hear us?
Sorry, I've asked you this question a few years ago, Michelle. I'm interested to see if your views changed. It was really about, is there an inherent problem in thinking about ABS when you're talking about pandemics? Because really the benefits that you want in a pandemic is you want the vaccine delivered to you first. But nations that are making the vaccine are unlikely to share it until they've satisfied their own populations. Yeah. So is it inherently built into the system a flaw in what benefit sharing might look like? So do we need to actually think about different ways of dealing with benefits when we talk about, you know, pandemic stuff under the WHO, compared to the way we're thinking about what benefits might be in our traditional, you know, CBD, plant treaty kind of benefit sharing scheme?
Yep. Mark and I have written a fair bit about how we don't think access and benefit sharing is a very good way to, like, tying access to pathogens never to particular benefits like vaccines and antivirals that never needed to be tied together, and yet the PIT framework did it, and now we're sort of stuck with this. So I think the main point to make about this is that countries are going to act on what happened in the pandemic before. And so if we're expecting lower middle income countries to share their samples, and in the coronavirus pandemic, they never got any vaccines, and we're doing, you know, we're talking about booster shots now before much of the lower income countries have got anything, that they're not going to share viruses. That would become their like one and only bargaining chip potentially. So yeah, Mark and I have always said that high income countries need to be the ones that move first, that start acting in a way that says to these countries that yes, we want to take your samples, but you won't be left out in the cold in the next pandemic. How could anyone have any trust in us anymore after what we've done during this pandemic? Has it changed? I remember what I said years ago.
I think it's just an intractable problem, and I just don't know how we go about working out. I mean, you want everyone to have the vaccine immediately, and really that's not possible. So you have to decide, and we wrote a paper about this a long time ago, you know, choosing who's going to die. There's no easy way to do that. There's no easy way of making those kinds of justice calls. So I wonder if we need to think about different ways of how we deal with those kinds of issues. And
I agree.
ABS actually, well, firstly, whether the WHO is the right forum for making those kinds of calls, having those kinds of debates, but also we need new mechanisms for thinking about how we might resolve that. So yes, thank you.
I might just mention while I've got the floor, a little while ago when the Germans announced the new hub this is different to the biohub, but this is the hub for epidemic and pandemic intelligence. And the German health minister said that they would consider trade sanctions on countries that didn't share information with them. And then the Director General backed him up and said, yeah, maybe we should look into WTO style sanctions on countries that don't share. I just think we need to, we need to be the ones that give something before we start like punishing people for not giving us what. Anyway, sorry, intractable is probably the right word.